is taking place in the mesophyll cells. And we can get even more specific than that. If you look within the mesophyll cells, you see that they're filled up with these little green organelles. Those are the chloroplasts, and that's the most specific we can be. It's in the chloroplasts, organelles, where the actual photosynthesis takes place. So if I ask you the big picture, you'd say, okay, Mr. Edens, photosynthesis takes place in the chloroplast organelles of the mesophyll cells, which are in the leaves of the plant. How's that for a mouthful? Let's look a little closer at one of those mesophyll cells. Look something like that, and you can see these chloroplasts here and here and here. In this particular mesophyll cell, they're showing 3 chloroplasts, but it's usually quite a bit more than that. In laboratory, when we do the laboratory on photosynthesis, you'll look at some cells plant cells under the microscope, and typically you might see 25 or 50 chloroplasts inside each mesophyll cell. Here's my computer drawing of a chloroplast. Chloroplasts are triple membrane organelles, meaning they have 3 phospholipid bilayers. The outer 2 are smooth phospholipid bilayer membranes here and here, and those are called the envelope of the chloroplast. The innermost phospholipid bilayer, the innermost membrane, is called the thylakoid membrane, and it is very highly folded. It's kind of the opposite of the smooth Gesundheit envelope ones. Right there is the thylakoid, and it's actually folded into disc-shaped folds, and I'm not sure why disc shapes in particular, but it ends up looking like a stack of pancakes or a stack of quarters or something like that inside the chloroplast. Each individual disc-shaped fold of the thylakoid is called one granum. So there's a granum there, there's another granum, there's another granum. The plural is grana, if you want to talk about more than one, but each individual one is a granum. Granum, 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 like that. All right, and one last little tidbit about the chloroplast organelle. There's a watery liquid that fills the inside, and that's called the stroma, which unfortunately sounds a lot like stoma, which is the opening in the bottom of the leaf to let in the carbon dioxide. So even though they sound a lot alike, don't confuse the stroma with the stoma at the bottom of the leaves. All right, now there's something kind of interesting about chloroplast organelles. They are one of the few organelles that have their own chromosome. Up to this point, when I've been telling you about cells, I said the chromosomes are in the nucleus of the cell. And for the most part, that's true. Certainly in plant cells, in their nucleus is where you find the majority of the chromosomes, the majority of the DNA. But each chloroplast has its own little chromosome. And to make the story even more interesting, the chromosome of chloroplasts is actually a circular chromosome. And where else did we see a circular chromosome? Anybody recall? In bacteria and actually archaea also, which are the prokaryotes. And so the chloroplast organelle has inside of it a little chromosome, just like you see in bacteria and archaea. And that actually, they think, relates to its evolutionary history. The current theory right now is that chloroplast organelles originated as a photosynthetic bacteria that sometime in the way, way distant evolutionary past, a billion years ago or so, some eukaryotic cell, some big eukaryotic cell, took in a small little photosynthetic bacteria. And it was what they call symbiosis, two living things living together. The little photosynthetic bacteria benefited because it now had a nice protected environment to live in, and the bigger eukaryotic cell benefited because it had a little source of glucose inside of it. And that's how the relationship started, they think. And then over these long periods of evolutionary time, the bacteria evolved into just another organelle inside the eukaryotic cell, the eukaryotic plant cell. So don't make any mistake. Right now, chloroplasts are organelles. They are not bacteria. You can't, chloroplasts can't grow by themselves if you take them out of the plant cell. But they think they did start off as a bacteria and then eventually evolved into an organelle. And they still retain that circular chromosome as a relic of their evolutionary past. And another thing to keep a heads up about, we're going to be studying the chloroplast quite a bit in this lecture on photosynthesis. And I think the chloroplast comes up so much, and because it has its own membranes and has its own chromosome, people start to think of it as a cell. And so if on a quiz or a midterm, I say, what's the cell where photosynthesis takes place? I guarantee you, half of you are going to write chloroplast. And then I'm going to have to mark you wrong on that. So if I ask where the cell is at photosynthesis, you've got to say mesophyll. But if I say where's the organelle where it takes place, then you say chloroplast. Alrighty, well, let's see. Photosynthesis is actually a two-step process. One of the steps is called the light-dependent reaction, and the other is called the light-independent reaction. Let's look at the light-independent reaction first. The light-independent reaction is called the light-independent reaction because it does not require light shining directly on it for it to take place. It certainly can function if a beam of light is shining on it, but not required. The light-independent reaction is normally called the Calvin cycle after the first person who discovered it. And it takes place in the stroma of the chloroplast, as you can see from this diagram right there. Now remember, the word cycle has a specific meaning. It's a circular metabolic pathway. A metabolic pathway is a group of enzymes that change molecules one little step at a time, where each enzyme makes a small change. And so these arrows represent a group of enzymes where molecules move around but get changed as they move around. And for each cycle, there's always molecules that feed into the cycle, and then they go around a few times and slowly get changed, and then eventually they get spun out of the cycle. And for the Calvin cycle, as you can see from the diagram, what goes in is carbon dioxide, and then by being reworked with those enzymes as they go around through the Calvin cycle enzyme several times, they eventually get spun off as glucose. If you read in your textbooks about this, they use the word fixed. They say in the Calvin cycle, carbon dioxide is fixed into glucose, which is kind of a funny term, but they're just using that to mean the carbon dioxide becomes part of a glucose molecule. Not like the carbon dioxide is broken and needs to be fixed. Well, I should say this, notice that this is a non-spontaneous process, to go from carbon dioxides to glucose. We are reducing some of those low energy bonds, which in chemistry speak means that they're becoming higher potential energy carbon-hydrogen and carbon-carbon bonds. So you've got to have energy going into this. And for enzymes, the typical source of energy for enzymes is the ATP molecule. So some of these Calvin cycle enzymes use ATP as their energy source to carry out this non-spontaneous reaction. Some of the other proteins that are involved in the Calvin cycle don't use ATP as their energy source. They use a molecule called NADPH, which I mentioned a couple weeks ago. This is also a high energy molecule, but it carries its energy in what we call high energy electrons, or energized electrons. And so these Calvin cycle enzymes consume ATP, and the high energy electrons in this NADPH molecule as their energy source to drive the non-spontaneous reaction. All right, so light independent reaction. It doesn't require light directly shining on it. As long as those enzymes have ATP and NADPH, it doesn't matter whether it's light or dark, they can make glucose from carbon dioxide. The other part of photosynthesis is called the light-dependent reaction because it does require light shining on it. It takes place over here in the thylakoid membrane, and it's where the ATP and the NADPH are manufactured for the Calvin cycle to take place. So in a way, this is the energy source for the Calvin cycle. It makes these two high energy molecules using the energy of sunlight and then feeds them right into the Calvin cycle. There we go. So in the light-dependent reaction over here, solar energy is converted into ATP energy and NADPH energy, and then those drift into the stroma where the Calvin cycle enzymes use them to power this non-spontaneous glucose-making reaction. I saw something in a catalog that reminded me of this process, and here's what it is. I thought this was kind of cool. Maybe you can see what's going on there. It's a special hat that fans you on sunny days because it has a little solar collector cell right here, a photocell. Isn't that neat? And then it makes electricity, and the electricity flows down through here and powers this fan right here. So which of those two, this part or the upper part, is like the Calvin cycle? The fan, the lower part, right. Because just like the Calvin cycle, it moves in a circle. But just like the Calvin cycle, it requires energy, but it doesn't require sunlight shining on this particular part. But this part is like the light-dependent reaction. It does require solar energy, and it converts that energy into a form that the Calvin cycle can use and sends it on down to the Calvin cycle. But here, in the real hat, it's making electrical energy, whereas in the Calvin cycle, or in photosynthesis, it's making ATP and NADPH and then sends those down to the Calvin cycle to operate. Yeah.